Why would the Pope, yes, the Pope, intervene in a Hollywood murder investigation? Why would the spiritual leader of more than 1 billion Catholics step into the blood-stained chaos surrounding the death of actor-director Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle? What did Pope Leo XIV see? What did he hear that made him break centuries of silence between church and state? It started as a quiet Sunday in Los Angeles. But by nightfall, a family was destroyed, a nation was stunned, and a global spiritual leader had spoken 4 chilling words. The sins run deep. This is not just another Hollywood tragedy. It's something darker, stranger, almost biblical in its unraveling. This is the murder mystery no one saw coming. And at the center of it all, a powerful, grieving son, a hidden document, a betrayal that spanned decades. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And a truth the Vatican couldn't ignore. But what exactly was revealed behind the Pope's private walls? Let's pull the curtain back, slowly, carefully, because this story has layers, and some of them are soaked in blood. Let's rewind. December 14th, 2025, 3:30 p.m. Paramedics were called to the Reiner residence in Los Angeles, a modest but luxurious estate tucked quietly in Brentwood. The call was coded double trauma. Moments later, police arrived, and then the bomb dropped. Rob Reiner, aged 78, and his wife, Michelle Singer Reiner, 68, were both dead. Initial sources spoke of stab wounds, the kind of wounds that suggest rage, that suggest personal betrayal, that suggests someone didn't just want them gone, but wanted them to suffer. But who would do this? Who could do this? Let's pause. Think about the name Rob Reiner for a moment. This man wasn't just another director. He was America's director. He gave us Stand By Me. He made us cry with When Harry Met Sally. He made us believe in true love again with The Princess Bride. The man was Hollywood royalty. And yet, in the final act of his life, it wasn't applause that surrounded him. It was sirens and blood. Now here's where things take an immediate twist. While the nation was still processing the news of Rob and Michelle's sudden death, an arrest was made. A name was released. And jaws dropped. Nick Reiner, age 32. Their son. Nick, screenwriter, recovering addict, estranged heir, was arrested on suspicion of double homicide. The public exploded. How could a son kill his own parents? But then came the court date. December 17th. Nick stood before a judge. And something was off. He looked dazed, confused, almost like he didn't know what had happened. He didn't enter a plea. He didn't speak. Some reporters whispered it looked like he'd been drugged. Others said it was grief, or guilt, or maybe both. But behind the scenes, something was shifting. Because that same morning, before the court opened, a single envelope was delivered to the Los Angeles Police Department. No return address, just a Vatican seal. Inside, a typed note from the Vatican press office with a statement from Pope Leo XIV himself. He was weighing in on a murder in Hollywood that alone should have frozen the headlines. But what he said sent shockwaves. This tragedy is not merely of man, but of morality. It is the fruit of long-rooted corruption, hidden pacts, and spiritual decay. Those responsible shall not be shielded, not by blood, nor by legacy. The LAPD didn't respond. The Reiner family remained silent. But the world? The world asked, what does the Pope know that we don't? Now let's talk about the second son. Because while Nick was sitting in jail, Jake Reiner was silent. Deafeningly silent. Jake, 35, had once been a rising reporter. Charming, sharp, and well-spoken. But in recent years, he had quietly drifted from the spotlight. Rumors swirled. Creative disputes with his father, personal grievances, even political tensions. Was there jealousy? A grudge? Was he, too, at the Reiner residence that day? Official reports initially said no. But later, leaked footage would suggest otherwise. So now we had 2 brothers, one behind bars, the other suspiciously silent. But the case wasn't about them anymore. Because the Vatican had entered the chat. And when the Vatican speaks, especially on something not religious, it's because they've seen something most people haven't. Here's where it gets darker and stranger. Because hidden in the autopsy report, released on December 17th, just hours after Nick's arraignment, was a small note most media ignored. Buried beneath the list of wounds, bruises, and toxicology results was this line. Time of death estimated between 3:10 p.m. and 3:24 p.m. Evidence of interrupted ritualistic behavior. Latin inscriptions present at scene. Ritualistic? Latin? Why would a double homicide scene contain inscriptions in Latin? The language of the church. The language of secrets. One anonymous LAPD officer later told an NBC producer off record, "I can't tell you what was on the wall, but when we saw it, everyone went quiet." Quiet. Because they were scared? Or because they understood? Meanwhile, the Reiner house was sealed off. But drone footage captured something odd. A black car, tinted windows, parked across the street from the house. Visible in photos taken the day before the murders. Guess who that car was registered to? Jake Reiner. So wait, was he already watching? Was he involved? Or was he trying to stop something? Because if you dig into Jake's past, and oh yes, we will, you'll find whispers of a different side. A secret side. Some say he turned deeply religious in the last few years. Others say he was investigating spiritual corruption in Hollywood on behalf of a higher power. Could that be why the Pope acknowledged him, without saying his name? Could Jake have been working with the Vatican? Or had he become their target? And what about Rob and Michelle? The couple had been married for 35 years. They were known for philanthropy, quiet dinners, and deep conversations. No public scandals. No loud feuds. But appearances deceive. Because just months before their deaths, sources say the couple had altered their will. Drastically, the Reiners allegedly disinherited someone and added someone else. But who? And why? The updated will is sealed. The lawyer who drafted it? Missing. The safe it was kept in? Broken into. And yet, Pope Leo hinted at this change in his statement. When money becomes the god, even family becomes expendable. And when family is expendable, so is the soul. What was he referring to? A betrayal? A secret inheritance? A deadly motive? One more thing. There's a reason this story hasn't faded. There's a reason people across America, across Europe, even in Vatican City, are still glued to every update. Because this case isn't just about a beloved Hollywood couple being murdered. It's about legacy. It's about faith. And it's about the terrifying idea that someone in the public eye, someone we trusted, even adored, may have orchestrated a massacre for power, money, or silence. And the Vatican? They've seen it before. But not like this. Not in front of the cameras. Not in Los Angeles. Not involving a man who helped shape American storytelling. Only to have his final story rewritten in blood. And so we ask you, what made the Pope break centuries of protocol? What was in that sealed document? Why are so many players suddenly silent? And why does the name Jake Reiner appear again and again, but never from official sources? You think you've heard it all? You haven't. Because the truth is about to unspool like a Hollywood thriller. Only this time, the ending hasn't been written yet. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. What came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. But let's rewind. Let's step into the final 24 hours of Rob and Michelle Reiner's lives. Not through the police report, not through media speculation, but through a chilling, minute-by-minute reconstruction, pieced together from surveillance footage, security logs, neighbor statements, and one haunting voicemail that never made the news. Because to understand the horror of what happened in that house, we need to see how normal it all looked, right up until it didn't. 9:12 a.m., Sunday, December 14th, 2025. The morning began like any other. Michelle Singer Reiner was spotted on her usual walk around the quiet Brentwood cul-de-sac. She wore a navy blue hoodie and yoga pants. No makeup, hair tied up. She smiled at the mailman, picked up her dog's waste, waved at the neighbor across the street. One eyewitness said, she looked peaceful, not a care in the world. Peaceful. That word would echo like a cruel joke just 6 hours later. By 10:03 a.m., Michelle returned home. The house, a multi-million-dollar two-story villa with marble floors and bay windows, sat just a few blocks from where O.J. Simpson once lived. Irony, anyone? Inside, Rob Reiner was in his office. He was reportedly reviewing a script, a dramatic political satire he had been co-developing with a young screenwriter. According to an unnamed assistant, Rob called that morning to cancel a lunch meeting in Santa Monica. "I'm not feeling great," he reportedly said. But was that true? Or was it something else? 11:11 a.m., the suspicious visitor. At precisely 11:11 a.m., Ring camera footage from the Reiners' front door captured a figure approaching. Tall, hooded, black jacket, face partially turned away from the camera. No knock, no doorbell, just a pause. Then the figure walks around to the back gate. Guess what? That footage was deleted from the Reiners' local server, but later recovered by digital forensics. And you know what's truly disturbing? The time of deletion was marked as 2:44 p.m., just 46 minutes before police arrived. So, someone was inside the home, deleting security footage, while Rob and Michelle were already gone? You're starting to see it, aren't you? This wasn't a crime of passion. This was planned. 12:28 p.m., the lunch that never happened. Rob usually ordered from his favorite restaurant, Giorgio Baldi. But no order was placed that day. Instead, a private chef was seen entering through the back door around 12:20 p.m. Carrying what looked like a catering tray. A family friend? A staff member? Not exactly. Because here's the kicker. The Reiners didn't employ a chef. Not regularly. Not on Sundays. And yet someone, dressed in chef whites, entered the home and never left on camera. Food poisoning theory? Nope. The autopsy ruled out toxins. This chef? Likely a disguise. And whoever it was may have been the killer. 1:15 p.m. Phone call to Tracy Reiner. At 1:15 p.m., Michelle made a 12-minute phone call to her stepdaughter, actress Tracy Reiner. Sources close to the investigation say Michelle sounded nervous but composed. She asked if Tracy had seen Jake's email. She reportedly said, "I don't like the tone. He's not himself." What email? That part remains sealed. But leaked texts suggest the message referenced a reckoning, family hypocrisy, and not waiting anymore. Now imagine this. You're the mother of two troubled sons. One is in recovery. The other has just sent a veiled threat. You've just called your stepdaughter in distress. And less than 2 hours later, you're dead. What would you do if you knew your last day had arrived, but only you knew? Would you whisper a goodbye? Call your children? Lock the doors and pray for time? Because at 3:10 p.m. on December 14th, 2025, Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle were still alive, breathing, talking, preparing tea in their spacious Los Angeles kitchen. The winter sun stretched lazily across the hardwood floors of their Brentwood home. There was no screaming yet, no sirens, no blood, just silence, a haunting silence. But what happened between 3:10 and 3:24 p.m., the 14-minute window the coroner later confirmed as their estimated time of death, is something authorities still cannot fully explain. So let's walk back through it, step by step, word by word. Let's try to understand what happened inside that house before everything fell apart. Because what Rob and Michelle did in their final hour, who they spoke to, what they said, and what they may have discovered, might be the very thing that got them killed. And the first sign was a broken wine glass. At approximately 2:55 p.m., security cameras from a neighboring home captured Rob Reiner exiting his garage and retrieving a delivery left at the gate. According to time-stamped footage, he opened a nondescript cardboard package, checked the contents briefly, and returned inside. What was in the box? The police report redacted the label, but one officer told a reporter under anonymity, "It wasn't what you'd expect. It was heavy, cold, and smelled faintly of iron." Let that sink in. Iron. By 3:02 p.m., according to smart home data retrieved from the Reiner's Nest system, the house's internal motion sensors activated in 3 zones at once: the kitchen, the hallway, and the study. That's unusual. Rob was walking. Michelle was reading. So, who triggered the third motion zone? Was someone already in the house? Let's go deeper. A housekeeper, who had the day off but often worked Sundays, later revealed something chilling. She received a missed call from Michelle at exactly 2:48 p.m. No voicemail, just a missed call. She didn't think anything of it until she saw the news later that night. When investigators examined Michelle's phone logs, that call was there. But curiously, Michelle's last outgoing call wasn't to her housekeeper. It was to Tracy Reiner, her stepdaughter. That call lasted only 18 seconds. According to Tracy, Michelle simply whispered, "Is Jake with you?" Then hung up. Why would she ask that? Why did she sound nervous? Why wasn't that in the police press release? Now here's where things turn ominous. At 3:11 p.m., a glass shattered in the kitchen. A neighbor heard it through an open window. Shards were found later, scattered across the marble island counter, with a few small drops of blood mixed in. Not much, but enough to raise questions. Did Rob cut himself? Or was there already someone bleeding? Forensics showed that the blood on the glass wasn't Rob's or Michelle's. It belonged to an unidentified male. So let's piece this together. Rob picks up a strange, iron-scented package. Michelle makes 2 rapid phone calls, one of which is only a whisper. Sensors detect movement in multiple parts of the house. A wine glass shatters. Blood is present, but it doesn't match the victims. Someone else was there. But how did they get in? No signs of forced entry. No broken locks. No surveillance footage of someone approaching the home from the front. Unless they were already inside, waiting, watching. According to data from the Reiner's smart refrigerator, yes, investigators even pulled this. 2 cups of green tea were poured at 3:08 p.m., and the kettle was turned off at 3:09. This seems like nothing, right? But here's the eerie part. One of the cups was found broken, smashed against the wall, as if thrown. The other was untouched. So one person panicked, threw theirs, and one never got the chance to drink. What happened in those 60 seconds? And who was the tea for? The timeline thickens at 3:13 p.m. That's when the hallway Alexa device registered a loud thump. This was followed by what Amazon's audio logs described as muffled shouting and sustained distress sounds. Distress sounds. That's the AI's terminology for screaming. Investigators requested the full audio log from Amazon, but the file had been corrupted. But here's the catch. Only that 1 minute of audio was damaged. The logs before and after? Fully intact. How does that happen? Some suggest it was a technical glitch. Others suspect it was wiped, deliberately, by someone who knew exactly what that Alexa would have picked up, what was said during that missing minute, and who wanted it buried. Now let's talk about what was found at the scene. At 3:32 p.m., a 911 call was placed from a landline inside the house. The voice? Unknown. The call lasted only 9 seconds. Dispatch heard panting, followed by 2 words. Too late. That's it. Too late for what? To save them? To stop it? To undo something that had already been set in motion? Officers arrived 6 minutes later. What they found was, in their own words, a double homicide with spiritual overtones. Blood on the floor. A trail leading down the hall. Latin phrases scrawled on the walls in what was later confirmed to be red ink, possibly lipstick. Non temibo mala. I will fear no evil. And beneath that, the initials JR. Jake Reiner? Jesus Redeemer? Or was someone trying to frame someone else? Because the next clue complicated everything. As Rob Reiner's body was removed from the scene, police found something beneath his hand. A piece of parchment. Folded. Slightly burned at the edges. On it was a passage. Not typed. Not printed. But handwritten. From Psalm 140. Deliver me, O Lord, from the evil man. Preserve me from the violent man, which imagine mischiefs in their heart. Continually are they gathered together for war. Why was that under his hand? Did he place it there? Was it a message to someone? Or was someone trying to send a message through him? Meanwhile, Michelle's body was discovered in the master bedroom. Face down, one hand clutching a rosary. But not just any rosary. A Vatican-issued ceremonial rosary, the kind typically given only to heads of state or papal confidants. How did Michelle get this? Had Rob received it during his secret trip to Rome? Was she praying in her final moments? And was someone watching her do it? Here's another disturbing wrinkle. One of the responding paramedics later gave an off-record quote to a journalist. There was a smell, like incense, but wrong. Sweet, metallic, almost coppery. And there were candles, melted into the carpet, like someone had tried to burn them fast. Candles, Latin text, parchment under Rob's hand, a Vatican rosary in Michelle's. This wasn't just a murder. This was a message, or maybe a ritual. But for what? And why now? Later that night, as crime scene techs were packing up, one of them noticed something tucked behind a floorboard under the bed. A small flash drive, labeled only. For Leo. For Leo? Pope Leo XIV? Why would a flash drive be hidden with a label addressed to the Pope? Police turned it over to federal agents. It has never been released to the public. But the next day, the Vatican issued their statement. And Pope Leo broke his silence. You see the timing, right? The flash drive, the blood, the rosary, the initials, and the Pope, who hadn't commented on any criminal case in years, suddenly unleashes a firestorm about spiritual decay and moral corruption in cultural dynasties. Who is he talking about? Jake? Nick? Hollywood? Or something else entirely? Because here's the last detail, the one that never made the news. Before the Reiners died, their home Wi-Fi connected to one unknown device at exactly 3:06 p.m. It pinged the Vatican's internal servers. Encrypted, untraceable, but confirmed. And 18 minutes later, 2 people were dead. What was sent? Why? And who sent it? All signs point to someone close. Someone who knew the codes, knew the network, knew the family. And if that person was Jake, why isn't he already in custody? The LAPD says they're still building a case. But the Vatican? They've already made their judgment. And what came next would tear the Reiner family apart from the inside out. What if the person the world blamed first wasn't the person investigators feared most? Because while the Vatican was receiving encrypted data, while Latin phrases dried on the walls of a Brentwood mansion, and while Rob and Michelle Reiner's bodies were being zipped into black bags, another drama was already unfolding, quietly, methodically, and with terrifying speed. It began with a knock on a door. Not at the Reiner home, but at a small, unremarkable apartment just 15 miles away. Nick Reiner answered it barefoot, and within minutes, his life was over as he knew it. Let's start with the moment everyone remembers. December 15th, early morning. The sun hadn't fully risen yet when police vehicles pulled up outside Nick Reiner's residence. No sirens, no flashing lights, just a calm, rehearsed approach that suggested something very specific. They already knew who they were there for. Nick opened the door wearing a wrinkled hoodie. His eyes were red, not bloodshot from substances, but swollen, like someone who hadn't slept or stopped crying. Police say he didn't resist. He didn't ask questions. He didn't even look surprised. According to the arresting officer, Nick simply said one thing as he was handcuffed. "I didn't get there in time." That sentence never made it into the official report. Why? Because it didn't fit the narrative they were about to sell. Within hours, headlines exploded. Son arrested in brutal double murder. Nick Reiner held without bail. Hollywood dynasty shattered. The public reaction was instant and ruthless. Social media filled in the gaps faster than the police ever could. People speculated wildly. Drugs, money, rage, inheritance, daddy issues. But what if the story was never that simple? What if Nick wasn't the killer, but the warning system? Here's what authorities said happened. Nick Reiner, age 32, had a troubled past. Periods of estrangement, a history of addiction, financial instability, allegedly frequent arguments with his father over money and creative control. That was the version released to the press. But what they didn't emphasize was this. Nick had been sober for nearly 2 years. He had recently started therapy. And just 3 weeks earlier, he had filed a formal request to be reinstated into the family trust. Not for money, but for access to documents. What kind of documents? That detail was sealed. But one family friend later told a reporter, Nick was scared. He kept saying, "They're hiding something. And if it comes out, someone's going to get hurt." Someone did. Let's talk about Nick's whereabouts on December 14th. Police claim he arrived at the Reiner home shortly after the murders, alerted by a neighbor or a missed call. But surveillance footage from a gas station 2 miles away shows Nick frantically buying bottled water and bandages at 3:01 p.m., 3 minutes before the estimated start of the murders. Why was he already panicking? Why was he already injured? Because yes, when police arrested Nick, he had superficial cuts on his forearms. Not deep, not fatal, defensive, the kind you get when you try to stop someone else from using a blade. But that detail? Downplayed. At the police station, Nick was interrogated for nearly 9 hours. The transcript, partially leaked months later, paints a disturbing picture. Nick repeatedly asked the same question. Did he finish it? Who is he? When pressed, Nick broke down. He said it would end this way. He said if they didn't listen, he'd make them listen. Investigators asked him to clarify. Nick refused. Instead, he asked for a priest. Not a lawyer. A priest. That request was denied. Why? At the same time Nick was being processed, detectives were searching his apartment. What they found was strange, but not incriminating. Stacks of handwritten notes, scripture references, old newspaper clippings about Hollywood scandals, and one printed email exchange with a Vatican domain. Yes, the Vatican. Nick had emailed someone months earlier asking for guidance regarding familial sin and generational consequence. That email was never answered, but it was logged. So now ask yourself, if Nick was the murderer, why was he reaching out for help? Why was he trying to stop something? And why would the Vatican be aware of him at all? Then came the arraignment. December 17th. Cameras everywhere. Nick was escorted into the courtroom in chains. He looked empty, not defiant, not angry, just hollow. The judge read the charges, 2 counts of murder. Nick didn't respond, didn't plead, didn't react. He just stared forward. One reporter later wrote, "It was as if Nick was watching a movie only he could see." And maybe he was, because just moments before he was brought in, Nick had been shown photographs from the crime scene. Photos no suspect should have seen. Photos that made him vomit. Why would police do that? Unless they wanted a reaction. Unless they wanted him to crack. But instead of confessing, Nick whispered something to his public defender. Those words were captured on a hot mic. "They're blaming the wrong brother." The feed cut instantly, but it was too late. Someone recorded it, and within hours, the phrase, "wrong brother," was trending. So let's talk about motive. Why would Nick kill his parents? Money? Possibly. But he'd been written out of the will years earlier. Revenge? Unlikely. Friends say Nick still idolized his father. Mental break? Psych evaluations showed no violent tendencies. So what's left? Fear. Nick feared someone else would do it. And according to one leaked psychiatric note, Nick had expressed concern that "my brother believes he's chosen." Chosen for what? While Nick sat in a holding cell, something else happened. A sealed federal warrant was issued. Not for Nick, but for Jake. Quietly, without press. Agents requested access to Jake Reiner's phone records, travel history, and financials. Why would they do that if Nick was their suspect? Because behind closed doors, investigators weren't convinced. Nick's timeline didn't line up. His injuries suggested interference, not attack. And the ritualistic elements at the scene didn't match his psychological profile. One profiler wrote, "Nick exhibits guilt consistent with survivor's remorse, not perpetration." In other words, he feels responsible, but not because he killed them, because he failed to stop something. The most chilling moment came on Nick's 3rd night in custody. At 2:17 a.m., Nick woke up screaming. Guards rushed in. Nick was shaking, drenched in sweat. When asked what was wrong, he said, "He left the mark. That means it's finished." What mark? Nick refused to explain. But the next morning, detectives reviewed the crime scene again. And that's when they noticed it. Something small. Something overlooked. Carved faintly into the wooden banister near the stairs. A symbol. Not Latin. Not religious. But geometric. A symbol matching one found in a notebook retrieved from Jake Reiner's storage unit. A symbol associated with an obscure belief system centered on purification through sacrifice. Nick didn't draw it. Nick didn't believe in it. But Jake? Jake had written about it for years. So why arrest Nick first? Because someone had to take the fall. Because public outrage needed a face. And because while everyone looked at Nick, someone else was moving freely. Deleting files. Boarding flights. Making calls. And possibly preparing to disappear. Nick may have been arrested. But the investigation? It had just begun. And what investigators would soon uncover about Jake Reiner's past, his beliefs, his writings, and his final conversation with his father, would make one thing terrifyingly clear. Nick wasn't the monster. He was the warning. And what came next would expose a far more dangerous truth. What does a knife wound really say? Not just about the victim, but the killer? Because if the dead could speak, their wounds would scream. And in the case of Rob and Michelle Reiner, the screams weren't just of pain. They were of betrayal. Let's get right into it. The autopsy report from the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office was released on December 17th, 3 days after their deaths, and just hours after Nick Reiner's arraignment. To the public, the findings seemed cold and clinical. Multiple sharp force injuries. Cause of death: exsanguination due to internal and external hemorrhaging. But beneath the sterile language was something far more telling. Because while both Rob and Michelle suffered multiple stab wounds, the nature of those wounds, their depth, placement, and variation, painted 2 entirely different pictures. One showed brutality, the other showed intimacy. And together, they told a story no one expected. Let's start with Rob. Rob Reiner's body was found in the hallway outside the master bedroom. Face up, one hand outstretched. almost as if reaching for someone or something. He sustained a total of 8 stab wounds. But here's the first anomaly. None of them were instantly fatal. Let that sink in. Not a single wound hit a vital organ cleanly. Not the heart, not the carotid, not the lungs. Instead, his wounds were messy, aggressive, repetitive, chaotic. Slashes to the upper chest, deep punctures to the abdomen, defensive wounds on both hands. Defensive, which means Rob fought back. Hard. But here's the kicker. Under Rob's fingernails, investigators found DNA. Male. Partial match. And it didn't belong to Nick. So who did it belong to? You guessed it, Jake Reiner. Now pause. Jake wasn't at the crime scene according to police. He was allegedly out of state. So how does his DNA end up under his father's fingernails? Let that question burn in your mind for a moment. Because the evidence was there all along. Now let's move to Michelle. Her wounds were different. Less numerous. More precise. She was stabbed 3 times. Once in the back. Once in the chest. Once in the neck. But it's the neck wound that changed everything. Why? Because it was surgical. A clean, lateral slice across the carotid artery. The kind of cut not usually seen in crimes of passion. The kind of cut only performed with anatomical knowledge. Let's ask the obvious. Was Michelle's killer calm? Focused? Had they done this before? And perhaps even more chilling, was it symbolic? Some criminologists believe Michelle's neck wound mirrored ritualistic practices in old occult sects, often symbolizing the release of voice, a silencing of secrets. Was someone trying to shut her up? Or worse, was she trying to say something? The positions of the bodies also matter. Rob, hallway, near the door. Michelle, bedroom, near the bed. But investigators noticed something else. Their bodies were not aligned with the blood trails, which suggests one thing. They were moved. After death. Why? Was it to stage the scene? To create a narrative? To hide something? And if so, what? Let's talk weapon. The blade used in the murders was never recovered. But based on wound depth and edge angles, coroners determined it was likely a single-edged knife, possibly military grade, 7 to 8 inches long. That's specific and rare, not your average kitchen knife. This was intentional, purposeful. Someone came prepared. Then there's the matter of residue. Both Rob and Michelle's wounds contained trace particles of something odd, cinnamon and clove oil. At first, it was dismissed as environmental contamination. But when lab tests confirmed those compounds were present inside the wounds, meaning they were on the blade, the question became undeniable. Why was the murder weapon coated in scented oil? Here's one theory. In some esoteric rites, blades are anointed with oil as part of ceremonial cleansing. A symbolic act meant to purify the tool used for judgment or sacrifice. Sound crazy? Well, guess what was found on the family bookshelf? A rare, out-of-print book titled The Theater of Blood, Sacrifice in Ancient Texts. It was bookmarked to a page about ritual purification through knives. And guess whose fingerprints were on that page? Jake Reiner's. Again. One more eerie detail about Michelle's autopsy. Her eyes. Wide open. According to the coroner, there were no signs of post-mortem eye closure, something that typically happens during body handling unless intentionally preserved. But get this, traces of a clear, sticky substance were found on her eyelids. Upon lab analysis, wax, not candle wax, cosmetic wax, used for preservation. Someone had deliberately applied it to keep her eyes from shutting. Why? To keep them staring? To leave a message? Or to honor her in the strangest, most horrifying way? Investigators still don't have an answer. Now, here's where things spiral even further. Inside Rob's stomach, medical examiners found traces of blue lotus. Yes, the ancient Egyptian psychoactive flower, used historically in visions, dreams, and rituals. Blue lotus is not sold at your local pharmacy. So how did it end up in Rob's system? Toxicology indicated he ingested it approximately 2 hours before death. Who gave it to him? Did he take it willingly? Or was he drugged? And what was he trying to see? The autopsy didn't just raise eyebrows. It turned the investigation sideways. Because every wound, every anomaly, pointed away from Nick and toward someone else. Someone colder, more calculating, with a knowledge of anatomy, a fascination with symbols, and a reason to make the deaths look theatrical. Sound familiar? Jake Reiner, who, at the time, was unreachable. Here's the moment that changed everything. On the evening of December 17th, the LAPD received a call from a Vatican liaison. They had just reviewed the autopsy. And according to our sources, the Vatican believed the wounds had a ritualistic intention tied to ancient purification rites. They asked, very specifically, was there a fourth wound on the male victim? Why ask that? Because in these rites, the fourth wound symbolizes the final passage, the erasure of sin. Investigators checked again. And yes, there was a fourth wound. Small, hidden under Rob's ribcage. At first, dismissed as incidental. But now, it became the key, a signature, and one that matched the same pattern found in a 2003 unsolved death in Italy of a film critic who had spoken out against corruption in cultural storytelling, who had investigated Vatican secrets, and who was found with the same wax on her eyelids. No suspects were ever named. But guess who was living in Italy at the time? Jake. Jake Reiner was attending a private seminar in Florence. A seminar focused on narrative influence in religion and cinema. Let that sink in. The coroner's findings became the tipping point. They forced detectives to reevaluate the case. Because if Jake's DNA was at the scene, if Jake's fingerprints were on the symbolic book, if Jake's timing, beliefs, and rituals all aligned, then the next question was obvious. Where is Jake Reiner? And what is he planning next? Because someone who kills with ritualistic precision doesn't just stop. They escalate. And as authorities prepared to track him down, they discovered something terrifying. Jake had already boarded a flight. To where? Vatican City. And what he left behind would break the case wide open. What kind of man runs toward the Vatican in the wake of a double murder? What kind of son vanishes while his brother is arrested, his parents are buried, and the world is demanding answers? And what kind of trail does he leave behind? One not of panic or guilt, but of method, ritual, and chilling design. His name is Jake Reiner. And until now, he was barely a footnote in his famous father's legacy. But if you follow the signs, closely, carefully, you'll see he wasn't just a footnote. He was the punctuation mark, the exclamation, the period at the end of a tragic sentence. Because while Rob Reiner spent decades crafting Hollywood stories, Jake was crafting something else, something darker, something sacred in his eyes. Let's dive into who this man really was, and why, when the blood dried, all signs pointed not to the son who was arrested, but to the one who disappeared. Jake Reiner, 35 years old, tall, clean-cut, former broadcast journalist turned documentary filmmaker. If you Google him, the first things that come up are KTLA clips, Jake on the red carpet, Jake interviewing politicians, Jake smiling stiffly on morning TV sets. He was charismatic, polished, but that's only half the picture. Because what you don't see online is what Jake did when the cameras turned off, what he studied, who he met, what he believed, and most importantly, who he came to fear, his own father. Sources close to the Reiner family say Jake was always different, quieter than his siblings, more serious, introspective, religious. While Rob basked in the glitter of Hollywood, Jake gravitated toward theology. He studied religious symbolism in college. He wrote academic essays on narrative truth versus divine truth. At first, it seemed like an intellectual phase, but then it deepened. One of his former professors remembers Jake's thesis proposal, a comparative study of gospel martyrdom and modern storytelling in Western cinema, specifically, how sacrificial narratives are misunderstood in a morally bankrupt age. Heavy stuff. But it didn't stop there. Jake stopped drinking, stopped dating, started disappearing for weeks at a time, retreats, monasteries, spiritual pilgrimages. According to family friends, Rob Reiner didn't like it. He called it extreme, unbalanced, a waste of time. Jake took it personally. One former friend recalls Jake whispering, he mocks what he doesn't understand. But when the reckoning comes, he'll listen. What reckoning? And how far would Jake go to be heard? Let's talk about the flight. On December 15th, less than 24 hours after Rob and Michelle's bodies were found, Jake boarded a private jet. Not commercial, private, chartered through a Shell LLC. Destination, Rome. From there, a second vehicle took him to Vatican City. Specifically to the guest house on Via di Porta Angelica, often reserved for ecclesiastical liaisons and visiting academics. So here's the real question. How does a failed broadcaster and estranged son get access to one of the most secure religious enclaves in the world? Unless he was expected. Unless he had already been in contact with someone inside the Vatican. Unless someone invited him. And here's the twist. That flash drive we mentioned earlier, the one labeled for Leo found under the Reiner bed, investigators later discovered its exact twin in Jake's storage locker in Burbank. Same brand, same model, same file structure. Only this second drive had a different label. It read, Act 2. What was Act 1? The murders? Or the confession? And what, then, was Act 2? Inside that storage locker was more than just the flash drive. Police found something else. Something that sent chills through the task force. A handwritten manuscript, nearly 400 pages long, titled, The Sacrament of Legacy, a Guide to Restoring Spiritual Order in Fallen Bloodlines. It wasn't fiction. It was doctrine, written entirely by Jake. And chapter after chapter detailed how patriarchal corruption in celebrity culture had led to moral collapse, how families like his had lost their divine compass, and how restoration could only come through bloodletting and rebirth. Let that phrase sit with you. Bloodletting and rebirth. And remember, this is the son who fled to the Vatican, not Nick. Jake. One section of the manuscript was marked with a red tab. It read, The time will come when the vessel of legacy must be pierced, not to destroy, but to cleanse. Let the patriarch fall by truth, and the matriarch by mercy. This is the order of things. Let the patriarch fall. Let the matriarch fall. The language matches not only Rob and Michelle's deaths, but the manner in which they died. Rob, overwhelmed, pierced repeatedly. Michelle, silenced with surgical precision. The patriarch by force. The matriarch by mercy. It matches almost too perfectly. So again, was Jake performing a ritual? Or carrying out a mission? Let's rewind a little. Weeks before the murders, Jake had allegedly requested a one-on-one meeting with his father. Sources say Rob declined, said they had nothing left to talk about. Jake was reportedly enraged. He sent a letter, a real, handwritten letter. Part of it leaked to the press. It said, You can silence my name in your will. You can dismiss my voice in public. But you cannot silence the bloodline's purpose. You taught stories to the world. I will teach consequence. Chilling and prophetic, especially when you realize Rob had, in fact, recently changed his will. Jake had been written back in, while Nick was written out. Why the change? Was Rob trying to reconcile? Appease? Or was he threatened? No one knows for sure. But the change came only 9 days before the murders. Coincidence? Or countdown? Now, here's something few people caught. In his KTLA days, Jake once covered a bizarre story about a televangelist who claimed divine visions during blood moon events. Jake interviewed him on air, mocked him even, but off camera, he stayed, talked for hours. That evangelist later claimed Jake asked for access to old texts, banned books, ritual references. Why would he want those? What was he looking for? And who else was helping him? Because here's the real shocker. Jake didn't act alone. Authorities now believe at least one other person helped him disappear, scrub files, and leak disinformation. An insider, possibly someone close to the Vatican. Which brings us back to that word, chosen. Nick said Jake believed he was chosen, that he was fulfilling something. But what? A prophecy? A vision? A vendetta? As of now, Jake remains a person of interest, not officially charged, not detained, but tracked closely, because someone who disappears with theological texts, flies to the Vatican, and leaves behind a death script, is not just a grieving son. He's a strategist, a believer, a zealot. And zealots don't stop. They escalate. And what investigators discovered next, hidden in a rented locker in Florence, would confirm their worst fear. This wasn't the end of Jake's plan. It was only the beginning. What's the most terrifying sound you can hear after a double murder? A whisper, not a scream, not a bang, not even a confession, but a whisper, delivered calmly, deliberately, and left behind like a breadcrumb soaked in blood. Because when Jake Reiner vanished into Vatican shadows, when Nick Reiner sat behind bars, and when the LAPD struggled to keep the public calm, a single voicemail changed the direction of the entire investigation. It wasn't supposed to exist. It wasn't supposed to survive. And yet, like everything in this case, it refused to disappear. What it revealed, and what it hinted at, was more than just motive. It was a warning, a personal one. And once you hear it, you can't unhear it. Let's rewind 48 hours. It's December 13th, 2025, the day before the murders. Rob Reiner is at home. No meetings, no press, just a quiet evening with Michelle. They order in Mediterranean food. Everything seems normal. But just after 10:12 p.m., something happens. Rob receives a call from an unlisted number. He doesn't answer. Instead, he lets it go to voicemail. That voicemail would later be deleted from his phone, but not from the cloud. And thank God for that. Because buried inside the family's cloud backup system, investigators recovered a chilling 18-second voice message. One that began with a strange static hum and ended with Jake's voice. This is what was said. You never listened. Not when I was a boy. Not when I was a man. You erased me, Father. So I'm writing my own ending. The blood will speak. It always does. That's it. Short, quiet, calm, but not cold. The voice was controlled, eerily peaceful. And when detectives heard it, they stopped breathing. Because it wasn't a threat. It was a statement, a conclusion, a decision already made. The voicemail was time-stamped, 10:12 p.m., December 13th. And here's what makes that even worse. According to Michelle's phone records, she called Rob just 10 minutes later from the other room. Why? Why would a wife call her husband inside their own home? Was she afraid? Trying to warn him? Or was she locked out of a room? Investigators now believe Michelle may have overheard the voicemail or a second call, and she panicked. Because less than 5 minutes after that missed call to Rob, Michelle called Tracy Reiner, their daughter. Again, she didn't leave a voicemail. Again, she didn't follow up. Almost like she was interrupted. But here's where things spin even darker. When analysts dug into the voicemail metadata, they found something that stunned even the cyber forensics team. The message had been modified. Yes, the audio file had been edited, digitally compressed, masked with a slight overlay of static. But why would Jake, or anyone, manipulate a voicemail? Experts believe it was to hide a second voice, one that faintly overlaps Jake's in the background. A deeper tone, mumbled. But 2 words are almost audible if you enhance the clip. It's time. 2 words. It's time. So, Jake wasn't alone. Someone else was there when the voicemail was recorded? Who? And were they also involved? Here's the kicker. That voicemail wasn't the only one. In fact, it wasn't even the first. A second, earlier voicemail was discovered on Rob's secondary number, an older line connected to his production office. This one came in 3 days before the murders. December 10th. It's shorter, just 7 seconds. Jake again. The script is complete. Final scene incoming. That's it. Final scene. Incoming. The language here matters. Jake isn't speaking like a man with a grudge. He's speaking like a director. As if the murders weren't an accident. They were an act. A final scene in a personal film only he could see. Remember the manuscript? The Sacrament of Legacy. A guide to restoring spiritual order in fallen bloodlines. This wasn't just ritual. It was narrative theology. Jake's twisted belief that his family had to fall in order for something higher to rise. That belief system, paired with these voicemails, paints a picture of premeditation. And not just in terms of violence, but storytelling. Investigators dug deeper into Jake's digital trail. They subpoenaed the data from his encrypted podcast, a small, barely followed channel he ran under a pseudonym, The Penitent Son. Most of the episodes were theological ramblings, but one in particular, uploaded 5 days before the murders, raised every red flag imaginable. The episode was titled, Endings That Cleanse. Jake's voice opens the segment. Some stories don't end with forgiveness. They end with fire, with cleansing. The hero doesn't walk away. He lays down his name and buries his father's. Who buries a father? And what kind of son believes that's redemption? Jake Reiner did, and he left a digital footprint every step of the way. The most haunting discovery came from an even more unexpected place. A voicemail sent not to Rob, not to Michelle, but to Nick. Yes. Jake left his younger brother a voice message the morning of the murders. It went straight to voicemail. Nick never opened it. And maybe that's a mercy, because the message says, "You'll thank me, Nick. One day, you'll understand. This isn't punishment. It's restoration. Don't get in the way." Investigators believe this was the message Nick referred to during his arrest, when he said if they didn't listen, he'd make them listen. Jake warned him, but not so he could stop it. So he could stay out of it. Let it happen. Let the scene play out. Let the story finish. But Nick didn't stay away. He drove to the house anyway. Too late to save them. Just in time to be framed. Why would Jake leave such an obvious trail? Why leave voicemails at all? Some believe he wanted to be caught. Not in the legal sense, but in the mythological one. The way tragic prophets always are. Seen, feared, then remembered. He didn't want to vanish. He wanted to be known. As the son who ended the story, so a new one could begin. But here's the final twist. The voicemails were traced to a burner phone. But not just any burner. A prepaid device purchased 8 months earlier. Used only once. To send a single file to an encrypted Vatican portal. That file, unconfirmed. But sources say it contained an audio confession. Titled simply, My Father's Voice. A title Jake had once considered for a short film he never finished. Was this his real masterpiece? A real-life tragedy wrapped in theology and blood. And more importantly, who listened? Because if the Vatican received it, if they heard the voicemails before the murders, and didn't act, then who's really complicit? And what's really being protected? Because what came next wasn't a manhunt. It was a reckoning. Why would the Pope involve himself in a Hollywood murder? Why would the Vatican, a sovereign state, spiritually removed from American politics, legally separated from U.S. law enforcement, risk centuries of non-intervention to comment on the death of a filmmaker? Unless it wasn't just about death. Unless it was about what Rob Reiner knew, or what he was about to do. Because what began as a brutal domestic crime soon became something much larger, a spiritual cold case decades in the making. And at the heart of it was a file, a single Vatican file labeled Operación Umbra. Translation, Operation Shadow. Let's unpack it. Because once the Pope opened that folder, the world would never look at the Reiner family the same way again. First, the facts. Pope Leo XIV has been an enigma since the start of his papacy. You may know him as the Digital Pope, a former cybersecurity expert turned theologian. Fluent in 7 languages. Obsessed with codes, patterns, and spiritual anomalies. What you may not know, he kept an unofficial archive, off the record, off the books, of global figures tied to what he called cultural idolatry and narrative distortion. Essentially, people in power who shaped public consciousness in ways that eroded moral structure. Hollywood was high on that list. And among those names, Rob Reiner. But why? In 2023, just 2 years before the murders, Rob Reiner made a secret trip to Italy. Publicly, it was said he was attending a film restoration summit in Rome. Privately, he spent 3 days in Vatican City. No press, no public schedule, no entourage. He entered through the Santa Ana gate. And he left through the same gate 72 hours later, with a file clutched in his hand. He was meeting with Cardinal Salvatore Leone, the Pope's personal envoy on matters of cultural distortion. We now know the meeting wasn't about film. It was about confession. Rob had something to tell them. And he wanted it recorded, sealed, and kept in the Vatican vault. Here's where things get explosive. 1 week after Rob's murder, an anonymous source leaked excerpts of a classified Vatican document to an investigative journalist in Berlin. The document? Rob Reiner's recorded testimony. Parts of it have been verified. Others remain redacted. But what we do know is this. Rob believed his family was cursed. He spoke of generational guilt, hidden compacts, and a son touched by a hunger for divine fire. He even named Jake. Described him as a prophet without a temple, waiting for his sacrifice. But here's the sentence that froze every Vatican investigator. He told me one day he would end the story, that only my silence was keeping the cycle alive. And if I refused to speak, he'd turn our blood into scripture. Scripture. Rob wasn't talking in metaphor. He was terrified, not of death, of legacy, of what his son believed had to happen to purify it. So what did the Vatican do? They sealed the file, labeled it Operación Umbra, filed it next to cases of cultic behavior, family bloodlines tainted by ideology, and a list of known spiritual disruptors. But they didn't tell the LAPD. They didn't warn U.S. authorities. Why? Because the Vatican rarely interferes with secular investigations. Their code is silence, unless the act becomes a spiritual threat to others. And that threshold was crossed after the murders, when the flash drive arrived. Let's go back to the flash drive found under Rob and Michelle's bed. It was encrypted, but Vatican technicians cracked it in 2 hours. Inside, a series of journal entries, audio and written, by Jake Reiner. Entries that began with theological musings and ended with tactical outlines. One file was labeled, "The Binding of Isaac, Stage Notes." Stage notes, like a play. And in it, Jake compares himself to Abraham. His father, Rob, becomes Isaac, the beloved, the legacy, the sacrifice. But in Jake's version, there is no angel, no divine interruption, only fire, only blood. And the last line, "The knife must fall so the word can rise." It wasn't just delusion. It was doctrine. Pope Leo reviewed the drive personally, and what he saw shook him, not just because of Jake, but because the ideology matched 2 other cases the Vatican had quietly monitored. One in Argentina, one in France. Both involved sons of public intellectuals who committed ritualized parricide. Both cited purification, restoration, legacy, and both left behind notes that mirrored Jake's exact phrasing. The vessel must be broken to be reborn. Is it coincidence? Or is there a deeper movement, underground, spiritual, radical? That's what Pope Leo feared, and that's when he made the decision. He released a statement. Brief, ominous. This tragedy is not merely of man, but of morality. It is the fruit of long-rooted corruption, hidden pacts, and spiritual decay. Those responsible shall not be shielded, not by blood, nor by legacy. It was the first time in over a century a pope directly commented on a non-political, non-war-related American crime. He wasn't just expressing grief. He was issuing a verdict. So what does this mean? Let's break it down. The Vatican had Rob's prior confession, knew of Jake's spiritual ideology, had access to his recordings before the LAPD, classified the case under Operación Umbra.